topic is physical discipline within the Black community. And before I get started, I want to acknowledge that the topics that I'm going to be talking about today might hit a little close to home to some people, might be a little triggering. So feel free to take time away from the presentation if you need it. And yeah, I hope that you enjoy this presentation and you learn a lot about how we can move forward with the knowledge that I will be presenting today. So in order to dive into this topic, we need to know what discipline actually means. And according to the Oxford Dictionary, as a noun, discipline is the practice of training people to obey rules or a code of behavior using punishment to correct disobedience. And as a verb, discipline is when you train someone to obey rules or a code of behavior using punishment to correct disobedience. And as a part of my research, I created a survey asking Black people from different generations and different backgrounds about their experiences with discipline. This survey collected an exact amount of 30 responses. And one of the first questions that I asked in this survey was, how do you define discipline? As you can see, we have, these are just some of the responses. One said punishing or teaching a lesson to somebody for their actions, the practice of instilling an understanding of ramifications for actions, usually prioritizing a change in the behavior or a change in thought, repercussions for your actions from which you are supposed to learn. And as you can see, most of these answers do align with the official definition that I have read before. However, discipline is a very broad term, and I really wanted to focus on a specific type of discipline, which is physical discipline, which is also otherwise known as corporal punishment. Physical discipline, according to the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, is a method in which a supervising adult deliberately inflicts pain upon a child in response to bad behavior. And some of the most common methods of this is slapping, hitting with the belt, and what I'm going to be focusing more specifically on today, spanking. Upon my research, something that I found very interesting was that Black parents are most likely to use spanking as a form of discipline. As you can see from this chart conducted by Pew Research Center, Black parents are almost twice as likely to use spanking as a form of discipline. And I found that very interested, and I wanted to find out why. And this is echoed even further with the results from my survey. I asked my respondents how if they have known or do know someone personally who is Black that have either used or do use spanking as a form of discipline. And 29 out of 30 people reported yes. And when I asked, were you spanked as a form of discipline as a child, 24 out of the 30 respondents also said yes. And this was I sort of kind of knew this, but I wanted to make sure that I had my facts correct. Just a reminder, this survey was completely anonymous, so I didn't want to disrespect any boundaries of my respondents. So why? Why is it that most Black people use or know someone that used spanking as a form of discipline? And when I asked my respondents, they believed that it was due to generational tradition. As you can see in some of the respondents, because that was how they grew up and it was instilled in our culture. I think it's because of generational discipline or trauma, probably because that's how my parents were disciplined when they were children, but it was also a spur of the moment sort of anger thing. So why? I keep asking why. Why is it that, being spanked as a child, as a Black child, is so common? Why is it something that most of us have experienced? And as the respondents said, once again, intergenerational trauma. This can be defined as the transmission of oppressive or traumatic events. Um, sorry. This can be defined as a transmission of oppressive or traumatic effects of an historical event. And so we all know, or at least I hope we all know, about the harsh and cruel experiences that Black Americans have had to endure as enslaved people. But what we don't know is that these effects and impacts that those experiences had on those enslaved people transmit through multiple generations to this day. And this has been proven through the study of epigenetics, which is the study of how behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way that our genes work. And so how does this connect, right? In order to understand how it connects, we need some historical background. So I just want you guys to pause for a second. This might be a little hard to visualize, but I want you to visualize a white enslaved owner whipping an enslaved person. I know this is, pretty graphic, but just visualize it for a second. Now I want you to visualize a Black parent whipping their Black child with a belt. Why do these, at least to me, these visualizations look very similar? And that's because the history of physical discipline does not come from Black Americans, contrary to the fact that Black Americans are the ones that practice this form of discipline the most. It actually came from white slave owners. Historians have found no evidence that forms of discipline can date back to pre-colonial West African societies. According to Stacy Patton from the American Psychological Association, once during the Atlantic slave trade and once brought to America, slaves as parents were under tremendous pressure to shape their children into docile field workers and to teach them the proper deference and demeanor in front of white people. Child deaths, brutal whippings and torture, sexual abuse, and being sold away from their relatives for the rest of their lives were constant features of plantation life. So these are just a few examples of the trauma that these enslaved people had to face during slavery that have been transmitted to multiple generations today. And so this brings us to a theory developed by Dr. Joy DeGruy, which is post-traumatic slave syndrome, or PTSS. This theory essentially says that because of intergenerational trauma, Black Americans live their lives through the lens of inferiority and develop adaptive behaviors in which they are able to survive in a world of white supremacy and power. And one tactic that Dr. DeGruy mentions is appropriate adaptation. This is essentially the theory that Black parents prepare Black children to deal with the chronic stresses that they would face to keep them alive. And so I'm going to show a video that explains this a little further, better than I ever could.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma. One of the things that's difficult for people is their first response is, oh my God, that happened so long ago. We're talking about people being captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, experimented on. And then you have to ask the question, did the trauma continue? Yes, so 300 years of trauma, no help, freed. No help, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children and generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impact. And what I did was I started to look at the African American experience, starting with slavery, as a real clear, long enduring trauma. I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors Survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response is, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute. Your son's the one that's really coming along. And the black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African-American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course, there's a secret. Because everybody black knows that even though the black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this black mother is working in the fields and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid. He's shiftless. He can't work because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, he feels really comfortable. Post-traumatic slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational part of your being. Didn't expect to live to be adults because what we call your
So sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
A single trauma. You don't even have to be in an environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of me? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. PTSD is a disorder that occurs as a result of a single trauma. You don't even have to be there to actually get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. You could just hear about something horrific happening to someone you love. So you have people who have experienced it firsthand, people who have witnessed it in their environment, right? People who are continuing to be oppressed. That exacerbates any possibility of healing. So it's not post-traumatic stress disorder because then it becomes part of what we call your socialization process. So you begin to normalize a way of living and being, everything from what we eat to what we believe it means to be a friend. All of these things are colored by history. And if you don't understand it, you're going to fold in things that you've just assumed are normal. But post-traumatic stress disorder, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future. There was a point where there were African-American children in different urban settings that didn't expect to live to be adults because they saw so much death that they started planning their funerals like at 13, 12, as young as 10. When you start looking at the simple biology, you start looking at the impact of stress on health. And while we look at general stress, we know finances, you have illnesses, all these different things. How about being black? How does factoring in being black in America impact your stress level and therefore your body's ability to operate its own immune system? Because we know it compromises the immune system. Once you understand it, then you can deal with it. Because you see, it's habitual. You're socialized. It becomes part of your being. So one of the ways you begin to address that multi-generational trauma is to work with the people it directly impacts, to hear from them. And when you give the people the information, they can use it. I think the first order of business is beginning to have a conversation. And the other is to educate the larger society. You have to stop the assault. So this is not purely a clinical thing. This requires social justice and change. That's where part of the healing is. It's not in a clinical setting or in a pill. It's in fairness and justice and safety and equity. We got to work with some of those clinical things, some of those issues of panic and anxiety. And we also have to deal with the fact that you have a system that is set up to oppress you and to continue.
So I just wanted to stop there and acknowledge that, yes, when talking about post-traumatic slave syndrome, we're mostly talking about African Americans, but appropriate adaptation applies to all Black Americans. Being Black in America, as stated by Dr. DeGroote, is a stress in itself. And us as Black Americans, whether no matter where in the country you are from, you I created a verdict that we subconsciously we use appropriate adaptation to use survival tactics that allow us to survive, again, like I said before, in a world filled with white supremacy and power. And so where physical discipline comes in, Black people are constantly being beaten, police brutality, killed, all of this violence that is put towards Black people, and especially Black kids. Black parents are scared for Black children to go out in the street, because there's always that possibility that somehow, somewhere, there's going to be violence towards them. And so the, I guess, essential verdict here is that most Black parents subconsciously believe that physical discipline is necessary in order to prepare those children for that violence and for the stresses that they're going to endure in the real world while being Black in America. So why is this an issue? You know, why is the use of corporal punishment in Black communities today, corporal punishment in Black communities today is a byproduct of centuries of slavery and racism that continue to chip away at the vitality of Black life. And so Black parents who use these methods of spanking and physical discipline, I'm sorry to say, but it only contributes to the dehumanization of Black children, and they only create more trauma that will be passed down to generation after generation after generation, creating a never-ending cycle. And so where do we go from here? How do we stop this? How do we stop this cycle? I'm going to list a few solutions and resources that I found helpful during my research. And I think that to those who are interested will feel very interesting too. So I just threw a whole bunch of information at you, basically saying that the Black community is doomed, but it doesn't have to be that way. So while conducting this research, I came across two professionals that I've mentioned quite often, Dr. Joy DeGruy and Dr. Stacy Patton. Dr. DeGruy focuses on the theory of PTSS, as mentioned before, and she has written a book on this topic, and also has a website that I will link in the chat for you all when my presentation is finished. And Dr. Stacy Patton, who focuses on this main topic of spanking your kids and why, you know, it doesn't work, basically. Which I will also link in the chat for you all as well. So for those of you who would like to know more about these topics and these theories, I definitely recommend that you taking a look at these links. And going back to my survey, I asked my respondents, how does your methods, of discipline differ from your peers? And I was actually delighted to receive responses from those who did acknowledge that spanking does not work prior to this sort of research. And I just wanted to take a minute to look at some of these responses. One says, I have not and will not spank my child. I do not want my child to fear, and I do not want them to resort to lying about something to avoid getting spanked. I would choose to correct them on why they did. Sorry, I'm just going to take a sip of water. I would choose to correct them on why what they did is wrong instead of spanking. I would do this because I feel that, like then, they would know why it is wrong and do these things instead of just being scared to do those things out of fear of getting spanked. I am far more tolerant of my children expressing themselves. I understand that children go through different stages of physical and emotional development. If I use spanking, which is extremely rare, it is only when a situation is extreme and I need the children to adhere to the boundaries we've set. There is a huge overlap in socioeconomic status. I would say most, if not all, of my peers are similar in that all discipline is verbal and based on family values and accountability. However, I think folks with less resources may utilize physical discipline. I want to teach my future children how to deal with their emotions in a healthy way instead of yelling, beating, spanking my child. I want to ask this simple question. What are you feeling? What's going on? Try to use your words. Teaching children at a young age how to not only identify what they're feeling, but how to navigate that feeling in a healthy manner is a life skill. My discipline involves communicating and maybe a little bit of phone taking, but never violence. Obviously, everyone parents differently, and I am not here to tell you how to parent your child, but I just wanted to bring light to these sort of alternatives to spanking that my respondents was generous enough to share with us. And lastly, we need to have conversations. The first step to confronting and tackling this issue is to talk about it with your family, your friends, your peers. The more conversations we have, the better we are at understanding how this issue contributes to Black people as a whole in a negative way.